Please go to elithecomputerguy.com in order to view schematics, code, and more for the projects that you are learning about. Welcome back. So in this video, I'm going to give you a brief introduction of what Linux is. So Linux is a very powerful operating system that many people use in the modern world. This is great for coders to understand, or IT systems administrators, or IoT folks. Really, anybody who deals with modern technology should know how to use Linux. So one of the first questions that comes up by new people trying to learn Linux is they go, instructor, I don't understand. So is Linux an operating system or is it a kernel? I don't understand the distinction. And then the instructor looks at that new student and goes, well, to make this about as clear as mud, yes, it is both. It is both the kernel and the operating system. But then somebody else in the back of the class goes, no, that's not right. That's not. What about GNU? What about GNU? It's not Linux, it's GNU Linux. And then the noob is like, what's GNU Linux? And well, this is when a lot of people start thinking, maybe I should give up. Maybe I should really be a florist. So when you start talking about Linux, it's important to understand that Linux is both a kernel and kind of, sort of an operating system. But a lot of people out there hate that people call Linux an operating system. And it gets all nasty. So basically the thing is back in 1991, this guy Linus Torvalds, he created the Linux kernel. The Linux kernel. So the Linux kernel, the kernel of an operating system, is the lowest level component of the operating system that basically allows all the communication to happen. So you can't have an operating system without a kernel. But it's also important to understand that the kernel isn't actually that functional for much of anything on its own, right? If you don't have file systems, if you don't have file managers, if you don't have ways to write, if you don't have device drivers, if you don't have a whole bunch of other things, the kernel itself really isn't that useful. So back then, there was a project from Richard Stallman. There was something called GNU. GNU, G-N-U, stands for GNU's not Unix. Basically, what Richard Stallman was trying to do is he was trying to create a Unix alternative. So it's important to understand, if you go back to 1984, operating systems are not like the operating systems of today. They're not flashy and fancy and all that kind of stuff. Basically, they were used for things like communications routing, basically very, very industrial type tasks. And so Unix back then was a proprietary operating system. And so if you wanted to build some kind of infrastructure project, using the Unix operating system, you would have to pay for it. And so with the GNU, the idea is let's create a free operating system so that people can then use this operating system for telephone switches and water pumps and all kinds of wacky stuff. Again, think about this in 1984. Now, one of the weird things with the GNU project, genuinely seems weird, kind of seems butt backwards when you think about it, is they essentially created all the code for a GNU operating system other than the kernel. Which is really weird. You think about file managers, device drivers, all of that kind of stuff. That was all written, but they hadn't gotten around to writing a kernel. So in 91, Linus Torvalds, he actually writes the Linux kernel, and then they think, oh, okay, look, we can marry the Linux kernel to the GNU project that we've been doing, and then we can have a full-fledged operating system. And so after that point, that is where we get what we think of as Linux today. So again, with file managers and file storage systems and all of that kind of stuff. So technically, and this is the important thing to understand, technically, most of the time when you're dealing with a Linux operating system, you are actually interacting with GNU Linux. So basically, it's GNU with the Linux kernel. That's the operating system that you're dealing with. But here's the thing. Here's the thing with Richard Stallman. Here's the problem. Real world lesson, right? Is it's all about branding. One of the important things about branding in the real world is you need a name people can say. You need a name that people can say, hey, what's that? And you can say, and so when you see the letters GNU, how do you think you should pronounce that? How do you think especially if you're a foreigner or somebody else, right? You look at GNU and you're like, I wonder how I say that. And then you look at Linux, Linux, You go, oh, I know how to say that. So when somebody goes, oh, what operating system are you working with? You go, Linux. And so that's where the operating systems that most of us use today, we call them Linux operating systems. We don't think about the GNU part because that was just a horrible piece of branding. Now, a lot of folks in the whole GNU project, they are not happy about this fact. And so if you start talking about Linux in, I don't know, a fanboyish type environment, you may get smacked in the nose and people say, well, you need to call it GNU Linux. But I can tell you, in the real world, in the real IT world, nobody cares about that. They say, oh, what servers are you running? It's like, oh, we got a couple of Windows 2012 servers here. Yeah, we're testing out a 2019 server. And of course, we've got our cluster of Linux servers. So in the real world, we just call it Linux. And if you're going to differentiate how you're talking about the servers, you may say, yeah, we're running some Ubuntu servers here, we're running some Red Hat servers here, we're running some CentOS servers here. So then again, at the end of the day, the whole GNU thing gets left out anyway. So if you're trying to figure out, is Linux a kernel or is this operating system? Technically speaking, it's the Linux kernel in the GNU Linux operating system, but everybody just calls it Linux. So now another question that comes up with the noobs trying to get into technology is say, okay, so Linux uses the same syntax, Linux uses the same types of commands as Unix. So Linux is then simply an open source version of Unix. And it is important to understand, no, that is incorrect, but it does get confusing when you're actually interacting with the operating system. Because when you're sitting there and you're dealing with a Windows server operating system, it is obvious you're dealing with a Windows server operating system. If you're using like a Mac OS, they have a server operating system, it's obvious that you're using a Mac OS, right? They're completely different. So if you go from that to sitting down to a Unix server operating system, it's very easy to tell them apart, and there's no confusion there. So a lot of people, when they sit down and they see Linux, and then they see side by side, they see Unix, and Linux and Unix basically look the same. Most way. They think, oh, okay, so Linux is just the community type of Unix operating system, and that is not correct. So Unix is its own operating system. Again, Unix has been around for a long time, and so GNU Linux, was basically created as an alternative to Unix. But when they were creating the GNU Linux operating system, they were going off of basically the standards of the time, and so the standards of the time was Unix, and so they sat there and they looked at it with the command line and all that, and it was a lot easier to essentially use the exact same commands within the Linux operating system that would be used in the Unix operating system to give essentially the same result. So it's one of those things where you can type in the exact same thing, you can get the exact same result, but how that happens is different. The underlying code is different. Now, really honestly, now in the modern world, this is probably not going to be a major issue. Most packages that have been created for Unix, they have ported it. They have created a version for the different Linux distributions, but maybe in some kind of enterprise type environment, it is important to understand that if you have some kind of package, if you have some kind of application that has to run on Unix, you can't simply slap that onto a Linux distribution. So they are two different operating systems, though in the real world, it's probably not something that's actually going to come up for you. So a big question is, why should IT professionals learn Linux? Now it's not as big a question as it used to be. Again, when I got into IT back in 2000, the fact of the matter is most people knew the Microsoft operating systems and very few people knew Linux. Linux was one of those cool, fancy things that if you were running web servers, maybe you would use Linux, but a lot of people, they just simply got their MCSEs and they deployed the Windows operating system. Well, the thing is, in the modern world, Linux has become simply more and more prevalent. It's prevalent in the servers, so a lot of the servers that most people use for web services, they're going to be using Linux. And a lot of the cloud type platforms, like platforms as a service, those types of things, they're using Linux. Not only that, but now we have Android. So Android, the mobile operating system, that is actually a distribution of Linux. So Linux has become more and more prevalent over the years, but you may be sitting there and you're thinking, well, if I know how to run a Windows server, why do I need to run Linux servers? One of the big things that people decide to run Linux servers for is the fact that you don't have to pay any licensing. Now, if you're dealing with Microsoft and you haven't taken a look at their licensing scheme, that is something that may bowl you over. When you buy a license for a server operating system in the Microsoft world, not only do you have to spend $600 to a few $1,000s for the license simply to be able to install that operating system onto a piece of hardware or a virtual machine, but then you also have to pay for things like client access licenses. So every single computer connecting to that server, you may have to pay an additional $50, right? You get into a company with 1,000 people, that's an additional $50,000 simply for the connections, and that's not even including the hardware and all that type of thing. And so a lot of people choose to use Linux simply because they don't have to pay those licensing fees. And now with a lot of the things that servers are being used for, a lot of the stuff that servers are being used for at this point really is kind of old technology. Again, web servers, database servers, a lot of this stuff really isn't that cutting edge. So if you sit there and you're like, well, I'm going to be deploying Apache or Nginx or MySQL, this is 20-year-old technology, why do I want to pay $600 for a server license plus client access license and everything like that when I can simply install Linux for free? So a lot of people just simply decide to go for Linux because it's the free, it's reliable, it's robust, it works well. So when you're going out there and you're thinking about using Linux as an operating system, a lot of people like to use it again for servers. If you're using LAMP servers, Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, something along those lines. Storage servers are very good for it. So a lot of kind of like those infrastructure type things, those servers again. So file storage, file servers, web servers, possibly email servers, those type of things. It's very useful to use Linux for. Also in the IoT world now. So in the IoT world, when you start looking at Raspberry Pi, when you start looking at a lot of these very, very small computers, they actually use Linux as the base operating system. So again, interesting thing from like a security or hacking perspective, a lot of things like webcams, like a lot of the webcams that you purchase, the network cams, like security cameras, those actually have an underlying Linux operating system that can be curious to hack. So a lot of the stuff that you're dealing with the IoT world, whether it's a network attached camera, whether it's some kind of phone, like some kind of voice over IP phone, whether it's kind of some kind of temperature sensor or something like that, a lot of those are actually using the Linux operating system. So if you understand Linux, then you can build or try to maintain and do something with those. And then finally, Linux is very good for specific tasks. That's one thing to think about between Microsoft and Linux. I'm not a fanboy for either at this point. I used to be really focused on Microsoft, and I used to really like Linux. At this point, as I say, just buy whatever the hell you need. But one of the things is Linux is very good for specific tasks. If you have a DNS server, if you have an FTP server, if you have a DHCP server, if you have a server that's just going to sit there and just do one thing all the time, Linux can be very good for that situation. I do have to say, from a more general standpoint, you may want to go the Microsoft route. Again, when you buy a Windows server, you're getting a lot of stuff with that. You're getting routing and remote access, and you're probably getting Active Directory. You're getting a lot of additional services built into that server. So if you're just sitting there and you're like, okay, I'm building out a network, it's going to have 20 clients, and I'm not really sure what this infrastructure is going to need in another 2 years, you may go with Windows Server because, okay, we set up DNS and DHCP and Active Directory right now. Oh, and then in 6 months, we set up routing and remote access. And then a couple months after that, and then we set up something else, right? It's very good Swiss Army type operating system, where Linux is really good, where you can just set it up and it will run forever. You set it up as a DNS server, or as an FTP server, or as a Samba server, and it will just keep running forever. So those are some of the things to think about why you should learn Linux and how it can actually be used in the real world. Now, a lot of people, they start sitting there and go, wow, so this is an operating system you can use for servers and IoT. You don't have any licenses. Wow, I really wish I could use Linux, but I've heard Linux is really difficult to learn, so I'm just going to stick with a GUI. I'm just going to stick with Windows. I've been dealing with Windows servers since, Windows 2000. I'll just upgrade to Windows Server 2019 and be done with it. We'll stick with that because I've heard that Linux is too hard. And what I will tell you is that Linux is that not that hard to learn? Again, as somebody who has an MCSE, again, been doing this stuff for 20 years, Linux really is not that difficult, and especially in the modern world with good, solid GUI interfaces, it is literally no more difficult to be able to administer a Linux server than it is a Windows server. But then you're sitting there like, well, no, but that can't be right. That can't be right. Because, I've heard all these things about how difficult it is. One of the things that I will warn you, once you start getting into the Linux world, is it's full of a bunch of smug people. Let's just say very, very smug people. High-level Linux administrators can be people in their own world. It is truly to a point that I find bizarre. Now, honestly, like I was learning, Linux years ago, and I went through one of the training programs that Red Hat Linux actually offered. So I don't know if they still offer it, but it was like 13 years ago at this point. And so Red Hat Linux had a training. It was a 5-day training, 40-hour training that was specifically focused on teaching Windows administrators how to administer the Red Hat Linux. And so one of the reasons that I took that particular class was like, okay, well, this will make it easy for me. They know people are coming from the Windows world, so they'll use examples, that type of thing that Windows people will understand, and so it'll be easier to learn Linux. And let me tell you, the instructor I had for that class, again, an official Red Hat Linux class, he was just from another world. He was just, literally, like one of the examples I give, he literally got to a point where he was showing us, there's a text-based web browser where you go to the command line. You go to the command line and you go to a website, and it literally pulls up a website in only text. Like text is just on the command line. And he was literally sitting there going, yeah, I don't understand why anybody uses, like a normal web browser. I mean, I just find this to be far superior. And he was sitting there looking at just, and you're like, what? And again, don't get me wrong, this is not like 1992. This was, I don't know, 2006 or something. And you literally have an instructor teaching a class for Windows administrators going to Linux, saying how this weird text web browser was a superior experience. And I think this is one of the reasons why people think that Linux is difficult, is because the people that really understand Linux, a lot of them are not very good with communication. They like what they like, and then they start showing people things that the other people don't really know what to do with that. And again, a lot of times it can seem utterly nonsensical. And so then it seems as if it's very confusing and very difficult to understand. The reality is Linux is relatively simple. Again, if you're going to be using the command line, the important thing to understand if you're going to be using the command line is that you simply have to understand commands. So, get a notebook or, get a digital notebook, do some copy and paste. If you're going to be doing something with your Linux server, completely understand what you want to do, what you're going to try to accomplish, do some research on how to accomplish that, and then basically you just plug in the commands with the arguments, and the Linux server will do that. So for a lot of people, they sit there and they see the commands and they see the arguments, and again, it's not right click, it's not left click, especially if you're using the command line. And so it seems like it can be very daunting, when in reality, once you actually start running Linux servers, it's simply going to be what you want to do with that Linux server. So you're going to, install the Linux server. It's like, oh, you need SSH. Well, in order to do SSH, you need to install the SSH server and do X, Y, or Z. Oh, you want FTP? Okay, well, this is how you install the FTP server. All these things are relatively simple, but when you're just sitting there and looking at it for the first time, it's like, I'm not really sure what to do with this. The other thing with Linux that is a little bit different than the Windows world is that capitalization matters. And so this is one of those, again, a very small thing, but it can scare a lot of people. Is so if you're referencing a file and you use capital F-I-L-E, that is different than lowercase f-I-l-e, which is different than lowercase f-I-l capital E. And so again, one of the issues that people run into when they're learning Linux and they're used to the Windows world, they're used to just being able to type words, and the capitalization doesn't matter at all. So they learn a command and they just go, okay, ipconfig or whatever the command is. And they don't think about capitalization. And so when they then go to type that into Linux and they don't use the appropriate capitalization and then that fails out, then that can be very frustrating because they're thinking, I put in the correct command, that command is failing out. Oh, I'm stupid, I don't know what I'm doing. And it's like, no, you didn't put in the correct command. The correct command was all of that in lowercase. And so that's one of those very simple things where Linux can trip you up, and then people think they can't learn it, when it's like, no, you just simply have to remember things like capitalization. So Linux really is not that difficult to learn. Just be careful of the smug people out there, and always remember your capitalization. So if you're listening to that and you're thinking, okay, that's not too bad, but how do I actually learn Linux? I mean, do I have to go to a class, or do I have to buy books? What do I have to do? One of the nice things in the modern world is that Linux is easy to get your hands on. It's easy to get information about how to use Linux. And one of the great things now is there's a hell of a lot of hardware out there that you can throw the operating system on, or you can simply throw it into a virtual machine. Again, this is a big issue going back 20 years. Is if you're going to learn an operating system, an important thing was having hardware to actually put that operating system on. Now, since you can use VirtualBox, so you can use VirtualBox for virtualization, you can install a VirtualBox onto your computer. So whether you have a Windows computer or a Mac computer, you can install a VirtualBox on there, and then you can install Linux onto that. Or you probably have a couple of computers laying around that you have no use for. You can throw Linux onto that. So one of the nice things now is basically being able to find a place to install Linux should be relatively easy. Now, when you're thinking about what Linux to install, so we'll talk about, in another video, we'll talk about distributions a little bit later, but there are a lot of different distributions out there. So when we're talking about Linux and we're talking about distributions, these are the different basically the different vendors, I guess you could say, of Linux. So you have Ubuntu, you have CentOS, you have Red Hat, you have Mint, you have a whole bunch of different distributions of Linux out there. What I would argue, especially if you're starting, is to go with the Ubuntu distribution of Linux. This is currently the most popular distribution of Linux, and so especially when you're learning something, it's brand new, you don't know what the hell else to use anyway, you might as well go with the popular one, especially since it's free. So you can go to Ubuntu, you can download the operating system, and then you can install it onto your computer or your virtual machine. Now, I will say, especially when you are learning, I would go for the desktop version of the operating system. So when you download Ubuntu or some of these other distributions, they will give you the option many times of the server version or the desktop version. Now, it's important to understand that in the Linux world, they're basically kind of sort of the same thing. Again, we'll talk about it a little bit later. It's not the same as the Windows world, right? So with Windows, Windows Server is more or less an operating system, and Windows Client is an operating system. And you can have the client sort of be a server, and you can do Word on a server if you really wanted to. But there's major differences in those operating systems. When you're dealing with the Linux world, really the difference between the server version of the operating system and the desktop version of the operating system is whether or not you get a GUI interface or a GUI shell. So the GUI shell, that's where you get the left click, the right click, the double click. You're able to use your mouse, do that type of thing. So if you download and install the server version of a Linux distribution, once it's installed, you're going to end up with a blinking cursor. You're going to get the command line, and you're going to get a blinking cursor. And if you're very new, that can be very intimidating because literally the server will only do what you tell it to do. And if you don't type in the right commands with the right arguments, it's not going to do anything. So what I would argue is that you should download and install the desktop version, because that will give you a GUI shell that it gives you that nice graphical user interface. You can right click, you can left click, you can go through files and folders, you can see what applications are installed, all that type of thing. And then once you get comfortable with that, then you can open up the terminal to get to the command line interface, and then you can start typing out and learning Linux commands. So that's one of the things that I would argue when you're going to be doing it. And again, you just go out there and try it. One of the important things to be thinking about with Linux when you're trying to learn Linux is one of the things that can be confusing for people is that Linux generally, again, it's not a Swiss Army knife operating system. When you install it, you get what you need, and then anything else, then you install that in addition. So you install in addition the FTP server or the Samba server or all these other things. So like when you're dealing with Windows, again, a Windows operating system is a very Swiss Army knife type thing. So when you're going to learn the Windows server operating system, then you need to learn Active Directory, and you need to learn routing and remote access, and you need to learn all of these different things to understand the operating system. Again, when you're dealing with Linux may only be doing one thing for you. So you set up a file server or FTP server, and all it's going to do is FTP. So at that point, something to think about is that really all you need to understand is you need to understand users, you need to understand permissions, you need to understand the file structure, you need to understand how to mount drives, you need to understand a few things, but then outside of those few things that you need to know, everything else is just an additional. Everything else is an additional package, something else that you install on the server. And so if you need FTP, then you install the FTP server. If you need SSH, you install that. If you need some kind of print services, then you install that. And so if you think about Linux, think about it more as, okay, I'm going to understand the base of what's required to understand how to use the operating system. And then everything else, I will learn how to use Hadoop, or I'll learn how to use OpenStack, or I'll learn, it's an additional thing that gets put onto Linux. So think about it from that core perspective, and then you're just simply learning about additional applications that you can install onto the server. And if you think about it that way, I think it'll be a lot easier for you. So when you hear all these great things about Linux, a lot of people then, the final question is going to be, well, should I just migrate to Linux now? Why hasn't everybody migrated to Linux now, right? If you don't have to pay for client access licenses and everything else, it's relatively easy to learn. Everybody should be on Linux. Well, there are a few reasons why not everybody is switching over to Linux. One of the important reasons is something called institutional knowledge. So when you're in a company and you have a support staff, so your IT folks, you've got 5 or 10 or 20 IT people. The fact of the matter is, a lot of these people will be career people. Again, they'll be 40-year-olds or 50-year-olds. They will have started doing system administration back in the 90s or the early 2000s. And so they have a tremendous amount of knowledge on how to run Microsoft servers. They may not have any knowledge on how to run Linux servers. And they may also not feel confident about running Linux servers. So one of the things companies have to look at is when they're looking to migrate or to upgrade to the next operating system, one of the things they have to ask themselves is, can their staff support the upgrade or the migration? And so when they're looking at it, and again, you've got 10 MCSEs that kind of sort of know Linux, you might be going, well, we could go from Server 2012 to Linux, but really, why don't we just go to Server 2019, because our staff will already know how that operates. And so that's one of the big reasons why people stay with Windows or even Mac OS is simply it's their knowledge. It is literally what they feel comfortable with. Another thing to be thinking about with whether to go from another operating system over to Linux is simply, does Linux support your applications? Now again, in the modern world, one of the nice things is that there are a lot more applications out there for Linux that work well. There are a lot of cloud services out there, so if you're using things like Salesforce or something else, they're simply a browser-based application anyway, so that has made life a lot easier for people who want to switch over to something like Linux. But you have to look and see, do your applications support Linux? So if you're running specific types of like financial accounting software, things like QuickBooks, like if you're running QuickBooks, will that run on Linux? If you have Microsoft Exchange servers, so Exchange servers are their email servers. Exchange doesn't run on Linux. If you have SharePoint servers, SharePoint doesn't run on Linux. And so one of the things you have to think about is you have to be thinking about what problems are you solving? What products are you using, and what works well together? If your company is using Exchange Server, they've been using Exchange Server for the past 20 years. You have people certified in Exchange Server. Then even theoretically, even if you could save $30,000 or $50,000 by switching over to Linux, it may not actually be worth it to the company to do that. So this is one of those things that you have to be thinking about with should you switch over to Linux, is there's a lot more that goes into that decision process in the real corporate enterprise world than simply one $50 client access license. There's a lot of stuff going on. And so those are the different things that have to be weighed about whether you should go to Linux or whether not. So that was a brief warm-up for this series of Linux classes. I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of what's going on, especially nowadays, because especially with things like verbiage, it can get very confusing. You know, what is a kernel and what is an operating system? So Linux is the kernel, GNU Linux is the operating system. But again, one of the most important takeaways out of this video is when you do a horrible job at branding, people are just going to call your product Linux. And no amount of argument's going to change that. It's just how it goes. So Linux really is. It is very easy to learn. Don't get scared. Again, there's a lot of snobs out there. There are a lot of people, stuck up, their noses in the air with little, oh. It's not that complicated. Basically, they just want to make themselves feel better, and so they make it seem complicated, so then you're like, wow, you must be smart. At the end of the day, I mean, really, it's a lot of note-taking, right? Because in order to interact with Linux, especially at that command line, you have to type in the commands with the arguments. If you do that, it works. If you don't do it, it doesn't work. So really what you've got to do is you just simply got to learn the commands. And again, whether you memorize that or put that down in a notebook, that's all you need to do to make the Linux operating system work. It is important to understand that Linux is not Unix. Again, GNU's not Unix. Unix was, I think it's open source now, but it was a proprietary operating system. Again, going back to 1984, they were looking for to create a free open operating system so people could use that back then. And so they use the same commands, the syntax, the same outputs that Unix was using at the time. And so if you put Unix and Linux side by side, for the most part, it looks almost identical. And so people get confused. And the important thing to understand is you can type in the same command and you can get the same result, but what happens on the back end may be very different. And so again, in the modern world, this probably is not going to be a problem for you, but if you have an application or if you have software that's built specifically for Unix, it won't necessarily just run on Linux. Or again, if you're running a Linux operating system and you need to install some kind of software for Unix, you can't just install it. It's not the same thing. So really, I mean, if you want to learn Linux, all you need to do is go out. Again, I would go to Ubuntu. I would download the Ubuntu desktop operating system, install that into a virtual machine, or install that into some crappy desktop or laptop computer you have around, and just go and start playing with it. So as always, I enjoy doing this video and look forward to seeing you in the next one.